Before the bells ever rang for the last time, before ink was scraped from stone and names were erased from memory, there was a night that history chose not to remember, a night when a kingdom learned that silence could be more terrifying than war, and that is where our story truly begins. Welcome, seekers of buried truth, to the Unveiled Scroll, a channel devoted to the shadows history pretends never existed, and if you value stories whispered rather than shouted, remember to like, subscribe, and share. Because tonight, I unveil a chronicle known only as the Forgotten Chronicle that unsealed a kingdom's final, unholy silence. The record claims to originate in the late 13th century, in a borderland kingdom omitted from most surviving maps, a realm officially dissolved, not by conquest, but by decree. Its lands redistributed, its people renamed, its past quietly buried beneath lawful seals and righteous language. According to the Chronicle, this kingdom did not fall to swords or famine, but to a decision made by its own ruler, King Aldrich IV, a man remembered elsewhere as pious and restrained, yet described in this account as hollow-eyed, long before his reign darkened. Aldrich inherited a land already trembling with unseen fractures. Monasteries reporting visions they refused to write down. Villages plagued not by disease, but by synchronized dreams, in which bells rang without towers and doors opened inward forever. At first, these were dismissed as superstition, until royal archivists began to notice something more unsettling. Official documents changing after being sealed, census records listing names of citizens who had died decades earlier, and court scribes swearing under oath that they had copied texts that no longer existed. The Chronicle names the source of this unraveling as the Black Reliquary, a subterranean archive beneath the capital cathedral, sealed centuries before Aldrich's birth, its purpose deliberately obscured. Aldrich, guided by desperation rather than faith, ordered the seals broken, believing knowledge itself could be controlled if confined. What he found, according to the Chronicle, was not heresy but confession. Thousands of parchment leaves written in the same hand across generations, each one documenting a decision made to preserve the kingdom at the cost of truth. Wars erased by treaty, massacres renamed as migrations, entire bloodlines quietly absolved through narrative revision. The kingdom had not been built on righteousness, but on selective memory. And the reliquary was the mechanism by which reality itself was curated. Aldrich's tragedy was not discovery, but recognition, because the final volumes were written in his own hand, dated years before his coronation, predicting his choices with chilling precision. The Chronicle suggests time within the reliquary did not move forward but inward, folding upon itself, binding future kings to promises they had not yet understood. Aldrich attempted resistance, ordering the archive destroyed, but fire refused to consume it. Water drained away from its pages, and stone cracked around it as if the structure itself rejected erasure. It was then, the Chronicle claims, that Aldrich made the decision that ended his kingdom, a lawful act recorded as administrative consolidation, but whispered as annihilation. He ordered every bell silenced, every chronicle burned except one, every citizen renamed under foreign census, and every map redrawn, not to hide the truth from enemies, but to starve the reliquary of continuity. Without a remembered kingdom, the mechanism would have nothing to preserve. The cost was absolute cultural death, a nation choosing oblivion to prevent something worse from surviving. Aldrich vanished weeks later, his body never found, his final decree sealed without signature. The Chronicle ends its first movement with a warning rather than a conclusion, stating that silence is never empty, only patient, and that the reliquary was not destroyed, merely waiting for a civilization careless enough to believe history is fixed. If this account feels disturbingly plausible, it is because erasure leaves fewer scars than conquest, and records, when curated too carefully, begin to remember us instead. This is only the beginning of the Chronicle, and in the next part, we descend deeper into the mechanism itself, where memory, power, and inevitability entwine beyond human intention. The second movement of the Forgotten Chronicle does not advance forward in time but sinks downward, as if history itself were a chambered crypt, each layer older yet more aware, and it opens with an unsettling assertion that memory, once organized, becomes a governing force rather than a passive record. The Chronicle describes the Black Reliquary not as a room but as a system, an architecture of continuity designed by an early council of clerics and jurists who believed instability came not from violence but from contradiction. Their solution was elegant and monstrous. Reality would be stabilized through narrative coherence. Events that threatened unity would be rewritten before they could fracture belief. And over generations, this practice evolved into ritualized archival law. Children, trained as scribes, were taught not only to record events, but to anticipate which truths would later require removal. And those selected for the deepest chambers were sworn to anonymity, their identities dissolved so the text could remain unchallenged. The Chronicle follows one such figure in detail, Brother Mathan, a junior archivist whose internal conflict becomes the moral spine of this descent. A man raised to believe that omission was mercy, yet haunted by the faces that vanished between drafts. Through his eyes we learn that the reliquary functioned by resonance rather than command. Once an event was recorded and sealed, future events bent subtly to align with it. Not through magic, but through expectation. Belief shaping behavior, behavior shaping outcome, until the written word became self-fulfilling gravity. Mathan begins to notice anomalies long before Aldrich's reign. Marginal notes appearing in his own handwriting that he does not remember, writing corrections to future dates, bleeding backward into present tense, and most disturbingly references to a final consolidation centuries before it occurred. When Mathan attempts confession, he finds his superior already aware, calmly explaining that resistance had been accounted for. That doubt itself was a stabilizing variable. The Chronicle emphasizes that no single villain designed this system. Only generations of frightened administrators making reasonable choices under pressure, each convinced that they were preventing chaos, until the structure they built required silence to survive. As Aldrich ascends the throne above them, Mathan realizes the king is not discovering the truth, but fulfilling it, his so-called free will narrowing with each decree he believes is his own. In a final act of defiance that the Chronicle frames as both futile and necessary, Mathan alters a single phrase in the master index, replacing preservation with cessation, not knowing whether the change will free the kingdom or doom it. The Chronicle suggests this alteration echoes forward into Aldrich's final decision, implying that collapse was not an accident, but the first unscripted outcome in centuries. The second movement ends with a chilling meditation that systems built to protect truth eventually protect themselves instead, and that when memory becomes law, forgetting becomes the only remaining form of rebellion. In the next part, the Chronicle turns outward, examining the aftermath, the empty maps, the renamed people, and the unsettling evidence that something continues to remember what the world has agreed to forget. The third movement of the Forgotten Chronicle emerges not from the kingdom itself, but from the void it leaves behind, a historical negative space where absence becomes evidence. And it begins by observing that erasure is never total. It only migrates into patterns for those patient enough to see them. Long after Aldrich's consolidation, travelers report a region where roads curve unnecessarily, where church bells exist without towers, and where legal documents contain footnotes referencing jurisdictions no longer recognized, anomalies dismissed by later scholars as clerical inertia. The Chronicle follows an itinerant surveyor named Elias Wren, commissioned by a neighboring empire to finalize border measurements. A man practical by nature and uninterested in folklore, whose growing unease mirrors the audience's own. As Elias maps the terrain, he notices repetition without cause. Villages spaced at mathematically precise intervals, yet bearing unrelated names. Dialects sharing grammatical structures with no shared ancestry, and ruins that align with no recorded architectural tradition. His internal conflict deepens as his instruments yield consistent results that contradict imperial records, forcing him to choose between accuracy and obedience. The Chronicle is careful to frame Elias not as a hero, but as a functionary, confronted with contradiction. The same role once occupied by the archivists he unknowingly reached. His discovery of a sealed bell beneath an abandoned chapel becomes the symbolic hinge of this movement, its metal unmarred by time, its surface engraved with dates that do not correspond to any known calendar. When Elias strikes it experimentally, no sound emerges, yet his notes describe a pressure, as if resonance occurs beyond hearing, and afterward his maps begin to change overnight, borders smoothing themselves, measurements converging toward an unnamed center. The Chronicle suggests that Aldrich's solution succeeded only partially. The reliquary starved of a nation yet sustained by residual structure, memory clinging to geometry rather than narrative. Elias attempts to report his findings, but finds his drafts rejected for inconsistency. His superiors gently instructing him to align with accepted frameworks, echoing the same logic that once governed the Black Relic. In a moment of quiet terror, Elias realizes the system no longer requires a centralized archive, because institutional habit has inherited its function. The movement closes with Elias sealing his final map inside a personal journal rather than submitting it, an act small enough to escape correction, yet meaningful enough to preserve deviation. The Chronicle leaves his fate unresolved, instead widening its lens to warn that when erasure becomes normalized, anomalies are not mistakes, but mensajes, and that silence, once institutionalized, continues to govern long after its architects are gone. The final movement awaits, where the Chronicle turns its gaze toward the present, and asks whether the mechanism truly ended, or merely learned to operate without names. The fourth and final movement of the Forgotten Chronicle abandons pretense of distance, and speaks with unsettling intimacy, asserting that the mechanism never belonged to one kingdom, one archive, or one century, but to a human impulse older than ink itself, the desire to make the past obedient. It opens by stating that modern historians unknowingly completed Aldrich's work, not by conspiracy, but by efficiency, streamlining narratives, resolving contradictions, favoring sources that agree with each other, and quietly sidelining those that refuse alignment. The Chronicle draws a direct, careful line from the Black Reliquary to contemporary archival practice, emphasizing not malice, but momentum. Systems inherited and refined until questioning them feels irresponsible. It describes anonymous committees standardizing records, algorithms prioritizing consensus, and educational frameworks rewarding coherence over complexity, all without ever mentioning the vanished kingdom by name, because names are no longer required. The voice of the Chronicle grows colder here, suggesting that the reliquary did not need to survive physically, because its logic proved transferable, a philosophy embedded in process rather than place. In its final pages, the Chronicle addresses the listener directly, reminding us that the most dangerous histories are not the ones filled with lies, but the ones cleansed of conflict, where nothing seems missing because absence has been normalized. It returns briefly to King Aldrich, offering a final interpretation of his fate, that he did not disappear, but became unnecessary. His function absorbed once the system learned to perpetuate itself. The Chronicle ends not with revelation, but with a conditional warning that if you have ever trusted a record because it felt complete, if you have ever dismissed an anomaly because it disrupted the narrative, then you have already heard the echo of the silent bell. And so, seekers of the Unveiled Scroll, as we close this chapter and fold the parchment back into shadow, remember that history does not vanish when it is erased. It waits patient and intact for someone reckless or brave enough to notice the gaps. Thank you for listening, and if this story stirred something uneasy yet familiar, explore the other chronicles on this channel, because the past has never stopped watching, and some silences were never meant to last.